I didn't expect staying to feel so quiet. There was no argument, no raised voices, no moment where someone slammed a door and made the decision obvious. From the outside, everything looked normal. If someone had walked in, they would have assumed nothing was wrong. But I knew something had shifted. I just didn't know how to explain it yet. There wasn't a single moment I could point to and say, that's when it happened. Nothing dramatic, nothing clear. It was more like a feeling that settled in without asking permission. Subtle, calm, almost reasonable. At first, I told myself it didn't mean anything, because that's what you do when you don't want to overreact. I said it was just fatigue, just being somewhere unfamiliar for too long, just my mind filling in quiet spaces with unnecessary worry. Those explanations felt responsible. They sounded like things a level-headed person would say, and I wanted to be that person. I didn't want to be someone who made decisions based on feelings they couldn't prove. I didn't want to treat discomfort like evidence. So I stayed. Not because I felt certain, but because leaving felt like it would have required an explanation I didn't have. Staying felt neutral, safe, like giving things more time instead of making a mistake too early. What I didn't realize then was that staying is still a choice, even when it feels passive, especially when it feels passive. The feeling didn't disappear the next night. It didn't grow louder either. It just stayed where it was, quiet, persistent, waiting to be acknowledged. I didn't call it fear. I didn't call it a warning. I avoided giving it a name because naming it would have meant taking it seriously, and taking it seriously might have meant changing something. So instead, I adjusted. I learned how to live around it. I told myself that not every feeling needs attention, that patience is maturity, that leaving without proof would have been irresponsible. Those thoughts came easily. They always do. And before I realized it, staying stopped feeling temporary. It started to feel like something I was already committed to. This story isn't about something terrible happening. It's about what happens before anything happens. It's about the moment when something feels wrong, and how easy it is to stay anyway, especially at night, when everything is quiet, when there's no one else around to reflect your thoughts back to you, when you're left alone with the version of yourself that's paying attention. That's when this began, after everyone sleeps.
If someone had asked me back then whether anything felt wrong, I probably would have hesitated before answering. Not because I was hiding something, but because I genuinely didn't know how to describe what I was feeling. Nothing felt urgent. And urgency is usually what we associate with danger. When something is wrong in a way we're taught to recognize, it announces itself. There's a clear shift, a raised voice, a moment you replay later and think, that's when I should have known. This wasn't like that. My days still moved the way they always had. Conversations sounded normal. People laughed at the same things. Plans stayed in place. There were no obvious signs telling me I needed to leave. And that mattered more than I realized at the time. Because when nothing looks wrong on the outside, it becomes very easy to doubt what you feel on the inside. I told myself that real warnings don't whisper. They demand attention. What I was feeling didn't demand anything. It didn't interrupt my day. It didn't stop me from sleeping. It was just there. A quiet awareness that showed up when things slowed down. I noticed it most at night, when the noise of the day faded and there was nothing left to distract me. I'd be sitting in the same place I always sat, doing the same things I'd done 100 times before, and suddenly I'd become more aware of myself in the room. Not scared, just alert. I noticed where I was positioned, how close I was to the window, how long I stayed still before shifting my weight. At first, I brushed those things off immediately. I told myself it was normal, that everyone becomes more self-aware when they're tired, that late nights make small thoughts feel larger than they really are. Those explanations felt logical, comforting even. I preferred them to the alternative, because calling it a warning would have meant admitting there was something I needed to respond to, and I didn't feel ready to respond to anything. I didn't want to make a decision based on something I couldn't explain. Leaving would have required a reason, a justification, and I didn't have one that sounded solid enough. So I stayed. I kept my routine the same on purpose. Same time, same place, same habits. Part of me believed that if I didn't change anything, the feeling would fade on its own. And sometimes it did. There were moments when I forgot about it completely. Hours where everything felt fine. Those moments became proof that I was right not to worry. I told myself if it were serious, it wouldn't disappear like this. But it always came back. Not stronger, not weaker, just present again, like it had never left. I didn't notice it immediately when it returned. That's what made it so easy to live with. It didn't interrupt anything, it just colored the edges of my attention. I found myself listening a little more closely to ordinary sounds, pausing slightly longer before responding in conversations, turning my head when there was nothing specific to look at. Small things, things I could explain away without much effort. I told myself I was just being observant, more aware than usual. That didn't feel dangerous. It felt mature. Being cautious is something we're encouraged to be proud of. It's framed as responsibility. And I liked thinking of myself as someone who didn't overreact, someone who waited until there was real information before making decisions. I didn't want to confuse sensitivity with insight. I didn't want to mistake discomfort for truth. So I kept labeling the feeling as something else. Not unease, not warning, just awareness. Something to notice, not act on. What I didn't understand yet was that not all warnings are designed to scare you. Some are designed to slow you down, to make you pay attention before things become obvious. But I wasn't looking for subtlety. I was looking for certainty. And certainty never arrived. There was one night when I realized I was sitting differently than usual. I was angled slightly away from the window without thinking about it. My chair had shifted just enough that my back wasn't fully exposed. I noticed it only after I'd been sitting like that for a while. And even then, I didn't react. I told myself posture changes all the time, that the body moves for reasons that mind doesn't always track. Still, I didn't turn back right away. I stayed where I was. That pause stuck with me later, not because it frightened me, but because it showed me that something had already adjusted inside me, without discussion, without permission. I wasn't responding to danger. I was responding to uncertainty, and uncertainty doesn't feel like a threat. It feels unfinished, unresolved, something you assume will make sense later. So I waited for later. I believed that if I gave it enough time, the feeling would either disappear completely or turn into something clear enough to act on. That seemed reasonable. What I didn't see yet was that waiting was already shaping my behavior, quietly, gradually, without ever asking me to decide. And that's why I didn't call it a warning. Not because it wasn't one, but because it didn't look like the kind of warning I was expecting. I didn't dismiss the feeling all at once. If I had, I might have noticed what I was doing. Instead, I broke it down into smaller pieces, manageable ones.
pieces that felt easier to live with. At first, I treated it like background noise, something that didn't need attention unless it got louder. That's how we're taught to deal with discomfort. Assume it's temporary. Assume it will fade once you adjust. And adjustment came easily to me. I told myself I was tired. That lack of sleep changes how the world feels. That being awake late at night makes ordinary things feel heavier than they are. That explanation fit perfectly. So did the next one. I told myself stress does strange things to perception. That when you've had a long stretch of responsibility, your body stays alert longer than it needs to. I thought of all the times I'd felt off before and nothing had come of it. Times when the feeling passed and I was glad I hadn't acted on it. Those memories reassured me. They gave me a story I could repeat whenever the awareness returned. I didn't ignore the feeling, I translated it. I turned it into something familiar, something reasonable. When the feeling surfaced, I didn't sit with it. I analyzed it. I asked myself practical questions. Did anything actually happen today? Did anyone say something unusual? Is there any real evidence that something is wrong? The answer was always no, and no is a powerful thing. It gives you permission to stop looking. I paid attention to everything except the feeling itself. I listened closely to conversations, waiting for a shift in tone. I watched reactions, body language, timing. Everything stayed normal. Normal can be very convincing. It makes internal signals feel exaggerated, unreliable. So each time the feeling came back, I adjusted my response to it. I softened around it. If it showed up while I was sitting still, I distracted myself. If it appeared during the quiet moment, I filled the silence. I stayed busy. Busyness has a way of quieting questions you don't want to answer. I told myself I was being productive, focused, responsible. I didn't think of it as avoidance. Avoidance sounds intentional. This felt practical. I also started reframing the feeling in ways that made it easier to accept. I stopped thinking of it as unease. I called it awareness, sensitivity, caution. Those words sounded useful instead of alarming. They made the feeling feel like an asset, something that showed I was paying attention, not overreacting. I liked that version of the story. It allowed me to stay exactly where I was without feeling careless. Whenever I thought about leaving, I immediately followed the thought with a counterargument. Leaving without proof would be impulsive. Acting on a feeling isn't the same as making a rational decision. What if I misread this and regretted it later? Those questions kept me grounded. They also kept me still. I didn't want to be unfair to the situation, to the people involved, or to myself. Fairness mattered to me, and fairness in my mind meant giving things time. Time became my justification. Each day that passed without incident reinforced my choice to stay. I told myself, see, nothing happened. You were right to wait. The feeling didn't escalate. It didn't demand anything. It stayed exactly the same, and that steadiness made it easier to dismiss. Urgency demands action. Consistency invites accommodation. So I accommodated it. I learned how to live alongside the feeling without letting it interrupt my life. I didn't realize then how much effort that took. I didn't notice how often I was checking in with myself, how often I was reassuring myself that everything was fine. Those reassurances started to sound familiar, rehearsed, but I didn't question them yet. I thought repetition meant stability. I thought it meant I had control. What I didn't see was that I was spending more energy explaining the feeling away than I would have spent listening to it.
And still, I stayed, because staying felt justified, because leaving still felt like it would have required an explanation I couldn't give, because I believed that if something truly mattered, it would eventually become obvious. I didn't know yet that not everything becomes obvious. Some things stay quiet until you stop arguing with them, and I wasn't ready to stop arguing. Not yet.
At some point, staying stopped feeling temporary. I didn't notice the shift when it happened. There was no clear line between waiting and committing. It showed up in small ways, in how I talked about the future, in how I planned my time, in how I stopped reminding myself that I could leave whenever I wanted. I didn't say it out loud, but leaving started to feel hypothetical. Something I could do later if I needed to, not something I needed to think about right now. And that mattered more than I realized. Because once something becomes later, it quietly stops being an option you actively consider. I noticed that I stopped framing things as short term. I didn't tell myself, I'll see how this feels for a bit longer. I just assumed I would still be there. That assumption settled in without resistance. Staying began to feel like the responsible choice. Not because anyone asked me to stay, not because I had promised anything, but because I had already invested time, attention, and effort. I told myself that leaving now would mean I hadn't given things a fair chance, that it would look like impatience. I didn't want to be impatient. Patience is something we're taught to admire. It's framed as maturity, as strength. And I liked thinking of myself as someone who didn't give up too easily. So I started interpreting the feeling differently. I stopped calling it unease altogether. I called it caution, awareness, sensitivity to context. Those words sounded responsible. They sounded like qualities you should trust. They allowed me to keep staying without feeling like I was ignoring something important. But there was a cost. I began preparing myself before moments that used to feel effortless, before conversations, before quiet stretches of time, before situations where I used to relax without thinking. I noticed myself rehearsing responses in my head, thinking through how I might react before anything actually happened. That alertness felt like competence, like I was being thoughtful, but it also meant I was never fully at ease. I was present, but not settled. I realized that I was monitoring myself more than I used to, watching how I spoke, how I reacted, how long I stayed quiet. None of it felt dramatic, it felt careful. And careful feels justified when you believe you're being responsible. I told myself that this was just part of adapting, that comfort doesn't always arrive immediately, that some situations take time to feel natural. Those thoughts kept me grounded. They also kept me from questioning why things still didn't feel right. I started making small adjustments to my routines. Nothing obvious. I chose familiar spaces over new ones. I avoided situations where the feeling became more noticeable. I stayed where I felt more in control. I didn't call it avoidance. I called it being strategic, managing risk. That framing made sense to me. It made staying feel intentional rather than passive. But intention can sometimes disguise inertia. I noticed that by the end of the day, I felt tired in a way sleep didn't fix. Not exhausted, just stretched. Like part of my attention had been held in readiness all day. I missed ease, the kind of ease you don't think about until it's gone. That was the first time I considered that something fundamental had changed. Not outside of me, inside. Staying wasn't neutral anymore. It required effort, and effort is information. I realized then that responsibility had quietly replaced intuition. I wasn't staying because things felt right. I was staying because leaving would have required trusting a feeling I had already worked hard to minimize. That realization didn't push me to act. It didn't scare me. It just made the feeling harder to ignore. Because once you recognize effort, you can't unsee it. And staying was starting to feel like something I had to maintain, not something I chose freely.
There was a point when I realized the feeling wasn't something I noticed anymore. It was something I planned around. Not consciously, not all at once. It showed up in small choices that didn't feel important enough to question. I started choosing my words more carefully, not to avoid conflict, just to keep things steady. I paid attention to timing, to when it felt easier to speak, to when it felt better to stay quiet. Those decisions became automatic. I didn't think of them as caution, they felt like awareness. I told myself I was being thoughtful, but thoughtful slowly turned into careful, and careful slowly turned into guarded. I noticed how my body reacted before my mind did. A slight tightening before certain conversations, a pause before answering simple questions. Nothing dramatic, just enough to register. I adjusted again. I created routines that minimized uncertainty. I stayed in familiar spaces. I avoided situations where the feeling became more noticeable. Avoidance felt strategic, like managing risk. I told myself everyone does this to some degree, that this was just how adults navigate complexity. And maybe that's true, but what I didn't notice at first was how much energy it required. I was no longer moving freely, I was navigating, and navigation demands attention. I was always slightly ahead of myself, anticipating, preparing, adjusting. By the end of the day, I felt tired in a way sleep didn't fix. Not exhausted, just stretched, like part of me had been held in readiness the entire time. I realized I didn't fully relax anymore, even during moments that were supposed to be easy. There was always a part of my attention listening for something to change, watching for a signal. I missed ease, the kind of ease you don't notice until it's gone, the kind that lets you forget where you are in the room. That was when I understood something important. The feeling wasn't waiting to pass. It was shaping how I lived, quietly, persistently, without ever asking for permission. I hadn't stayed the same person while waiting. I had adapted. And adaptation can be so gradual that it feels like growth. But growth usually feels expansive. This felt narrow, contained. I started wondering when the last time was that I'd felt completely settled. Not happy, just settled. I couldn't remember. That absence stood out more than any fear would have. Because fear comes and goes, but losing ease changes the texture of your days. I wasn't reacting to danger. I was living inside vigilance. And vigilance doesn't announce itself loudly. It just keeps you alert long after there's a reason to be. That was when I realized the feeling wasn't something external. It wasn't tied to a moment or a person or a place. It was information. Information about how much effort it took to stay. And I was finally starting to listen.
There was a moment when ignoring the feeling stopped being effortless. It didn't happen suddenly. It didn't announce itself. I just noticed that staying required more work than it used to. I found myself talking myself through moments that had once felt simple. I reminded myself, again, that nothing was technically wrong, that no lines had been crossed, that there was no clear reason to leave. Those reminders started to sound familiar, not reassuring, rehearsed. I wasn't discovering comfort anymore. I was repeating it. The feeling didn't grow louder. It didn't escalate or demand attention. It just stayed where it had always been, consistent. And consistency is harder to dismiss than urgency. Urgency fades.
consistency lingers. I noticed how often I checked in with myself, how often I paused internally to assess whether I was still okay. Those check-ins weren't dramatic. They were quiet, habitual, and they took energy. I realized I was spending more time managing the feeling than I would have spent responding to it. That realization didn't push me to act right away, but it changed how I understood what was happening. Staying no longer felt like patience, it felt like maintenance. I was maintaining an explanation, maintaining a version of events that allowed me to stay where I was. I asked myself a question one night, not out loud, not emotionally, just honestly. If nothing changes, can I keep living like this? I didn't answer it, but the fact that I asked mattered, because it meant something had shifted. The feeling had crossed a line. It was no longer a signal I could reinterpret. It had become information. Information about what staying was costing me. I noticed how much effort went into making things feel normal, how often I minimized my own reactions, how quickly I explained things away before they had time to settle. None of that felt neutral anymore. It felt active, intentional. I wasn't just staying. I was choosing to override something inside me, repeatedly. That choice didn't feel dramatic, it felt heavy. I realized that ignoring the feeling wasn't protecting me from making a mistake. It was keeping me in a constant state of adjustment. I wasn't moving forward, I was holding position. And holding position requires strength, more strength than leaving sometimes. I understood then that the feeling wasn't asking for certainty. It wasn't waiting for proof. It was asking whether I was willing to keep negotiating with myself. That question stayed with me, not loudly, not urgently, but steadily. And once a question becomes steady, it's hard to unhear. I couldn't pretend anymore that ignoring the feeling was the easier option. It had become the harder one, and I was starting to feel the weight of that choice. It took me a long time to understand what the feeling was actually doing. For most of the time I stayed, I treated it like a problem to manage, something inconvenient, something to work around. I assumed it was there because something was wrong with me, that I was overthinking, that I was too sensitive, that I needed to be more patient, more grounded, more rational. I never considered that the feeling might be doing something useful, not warning me about danger, not predicting something bad, just protecting something quieter, my attention. I started to notice this only after I stopped arguing with it. Not intentionally, I didn't decide to change how I felt, I just grew tired of explaining it away. And in that tiredness, I began to notice small shifts. Moments when my body reacted before my thoughts did. When I imagined leaving, even briefly, something in me softened. My shoulders dropped slightly, my breathing slowed. When I imagined staying, that same tightness returned. Not panic, not fear, resistance. That contrast stood out to me because I hadn't been able to think my way to clarity, but my body seemed to know something my mind kept postponing. The feeling wasn't telling me that something terrible was about to happen. It wasn't predicting harm. It was keeping me from fully settling into something that didn't fit. I had mistaken discomfort for instability, but sometimes discomfort is clarity trying to get through quietly. I looked back at how much effort I'd put into staying, the explanations I'd repeated, the patience I kept congratulating myself for, the adjustments I'd made without ever questioning why. None of that came naturally. It required constant attention. Leaving, at least in my imagination, felt simpler, quieter. That surprised me.
I had assumed leaving would feel chaotic, impulsive, destabilizing. Instead, it felt like releasing tension I didn't realize I was holding. That was when I understood something important. The feeling wasn't asking me to act impulsively. It wasn't pushing me to run. It was asking me to stop negotiating with myself, to stop treating unease like something I needed to earn the right to feel. I had been waiting for certainty, for proof, for a moment clear enough to justify action. But the feeling wasn't built on evidence, it was built on alignment. And alignment doesn't announce itself loudly, it doesn't make demands. It simply becomes easier to breathe when you move toward it. I realized then that the feeling had been protecting my ability to notice when I was forcing myself to adapt instead of actually fitting. It had kept me from fully disappearing into a version of my life that required constant vigilance. It hadn't failed me. I had just misunderstood it.
I didn't leave right away after I understood what the feeling was doing. That part matters because clarity doesn't always lead to action the moment it arrives. Sometimes it just changes how you stand in a place. After that realization, I stopped arguing with myself. I didn't try to explain the feeling away anymore. I didn't demand that it justify itself. I let it exist without trying to fix it. That alone changed something. The pressure eased. Not because the situation improved, not because anything outside of me shifted, but because I stopped pretending I didn't know what I was feeling. For the first time, I wasn't trying to override myself. I noticed how much quieter my thoughts became when I stopped negotiating, how the constant internal checking softened. The feeling was still there, but it wasn't heavy anymore. It felt honest. I didn't make any sudden decisions. I didn't announce anything. I didn't turn it into a moment. I just stopped forcing myself to stay in a posture that required effort. Leaving became possible before it became necessary. That distinction mattered. I didn't wait for permission. I didn't wait for certainty. I didn't wait for the feeling to turn into proof. I listened without evidence, and that was enough. When I finally left, it didn't feel dramatic. It didn't feel brave. It felt clear, like stepping out of a room where I'd been holding my breath longer than I realized. Looking back now, I don't judge myself for staying as long as I did. I understand why I needed reasons, why I wanted to be fair, why I thought patience meant something had to improve eventually. Those instincts weren't wrong. They were just incomplete. I've learned something since then. Not every decision needs to be defended. Not every feeling needs to be proven before it's respected. Some choices don't come with explanations that sound convincing to anyone else. They just come with relief. Now, when that quiet sense of wrongness appears, I treat it differently. I don't rush, I don't panic, but I don't ignore it either. I let it sit, I listen, because sometimes the most honest information you get isn't logical. It's the simple knowledge that something doesn't fit, and listening to that, even softly, can change the direction of your life. After everyone sleeps.